Good morning. This is Faith at Faith and Books, and this is my first installment of my May is for Magazine challenge, which I came up with a couple of months ago. I think only, as far as I know, Sean Standfast is also participating, and he is doing better than I am because he put a video out yesterday, and he's going to try and do it every day because he really collects these magazines, which is really fun, and I appreciated his video yesterday. It was an article, and I forget what year it was from, 1880 something, about quarantine. That was really interesting. So the challenge is that you find magazine articles, or you could just do one article in the month of May that was published before you were born. And what you do is you read it and then you do a review. Because it's interesting to learn about history, contemporaneously with when it's happening or closer to the time when it happened, by reading these old magazine articles. I was inspired to do this because my husband, a couple of years ago, maybe longer than that, went through this reading jag where he was really into the progressive era, and he started with Teddy Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War, and he became fascinated with the author Booth Tarkington. That's a little bit later. And so he wound up just buying some of these old magazines. He kept hearing about McClure's, and so he wanted to see what people were saying at the time. So he didn't do it in any sort of methodical way. He just sort of found some for sale and bought them. But they've been sitting there on my shelf, and I'm doing a year of reading one's own, where you just read the books that are on your shelf that have been unread for a while. And these have been sitting unread, and I've been wanting to read them. But they're very old and fragile. So I decided, let me create an opportunity that will help me focus on reading these. And I thought maybe anybody who wants to join in, please feel free. It just has to be something before you were born. And you can, it has to have been originally a magazine article. You can find them online. You can find a bound version of, an archive or compilation of articles. However you access it is fine. Just has to be an article that was written before you were born. So I think I'm going to try and do this 3 times a week. Twice a week I'm going to focus on McClure's, and then I have another magazine that's really a niche thing. It's the magazines from the 1950s, written by a particular woman with a very Catholic audience as their target. And I think I'm going to do those on Sundays, so tomorrow. And mostly I'm going to try and do these Mondays and Wednesdays. But since May just started, I'm going to do one today, which is Saturday. So the first, I thought I'd do it in chronological order, so I'm going to start with the earliest volume that I have, and I decided to focus on women writers because I was surprised looking at these how many women authors there are in 1893. This is the 3rd volume that the magazine published. It started in June. This is August 1893, and I was surprised because I think we don't appreciate those early women. There's a few names that stand out that get repeated, but there were a lot of women that were, forging a new way, a new path, and I think we tend to forget about them. And there's so many names that are familiar in this magazine because in its heyday, it really was kind of a powerhouse. It was, in fact, it was a woman author that wrote for this magazine, Ida, what's her name, Tarbell, who wrote an article on, or a series of articles, an expose really on Standard Oil. And so she was an early journalist. She was a journalist and a woman. So, but there are a lot of other women here who seem to have gotten forgotten. And they're sharing the pages with people like Conan Doyle or Robert Louis Stevenson or Bret Harte or Stephen Crane or a lot of other big names. and but somehow we've forgotten about them. And I think we need to remember them. It's not that I don't think the things written by men in these magazines aren't really, really valuable and very interesting, but I just want to focus on women, especially because the other day, my 18-year-old daughter came to show me this funny clip of somebody had put together all the different Folger coffee ads from the 1950s. And, you know, every single one of them, this went on for minutes, was a wife being scolded by her husband because she made bad coffee. So then she has to go to her neighbor. She goes to the grocer. Oh, what can I do? Sam, or whatever his name is, doesn't like my coffee. And it was so silly and dumb. And it really portrays, you know, marriage in the 50s as this really bizarre institution. But, you know, there were ads. They were trying to make women feel inadequate. And there was this weird, you know, new cultural thing that was trying to, I guess, put women back in their place after the 40s, after World War II, when women had to go into factories and help make, you know, aircraft and things like that, and sort of take over while the men went off to fight. And but, you know, that is not reflective of most regular people. I mean, I came from a marriage that existed in the 50s, and you know what? My father was the earlier riser, and he got up and he made coffee for my mother. So it wasn't, you know, life was not like a Folgers coffee commercial. And I think we forget that, and so I think it's good to delve into deeper history and not the sort of superficial, shallow, stereotypical stuff that gets presented a lot by media. Because it's just, you know, in a way, it's fake news. It's not representative of what really happened. And so that's why I want to focus on women. There were women journalists who were important back in 1893. And that's a good thing to know and a good thing to acknowledge. So that's why I'm going to focus on women. Now, in this edition, the article I'm going to focus on that I read was Mrs. Gladstone's Good Works by someone I've never heard of. Not that I know anything, really. I'm pretty ignorant about all this. Mary C. Burnett. So I didn't find out anything about Mary C. Burnett, what her story is. But I did read the article about Mrs. Gladstone. So what was his name? William Gladstone was the Prime Minister of England for many years, I believe, and he was generally looked up to. And she got to be whatever they call the first lady in England. And it's just basically a review of all her philanthropy. So she opened up orphanages and convalescent homes. It was interesting because we're in the middle of this pandemic, and she was dealing with people who had recovered from cholera but couldn't go right back to work. There had been this terrible sweep through of cholera in this particular area of England, and the people couldn't go right back to work. They needed time to gain their strength back and their health back. And so even though they'd survived the worst of it. And so she opened up a home for those people, a convalescent home. She had a home for people who were homeless and completely down on their luck. And she would give them a week. They could come, you know, they could bathe, they could get new clothes, they could clean up, and then they would help them find a job somewhere. She had a whole home where she took orphan girls and trained them to be good servants. So it was really interesting to read because I just finished reading Rose in Bloom by Louisa May Alcott, which was, I think, written in 1871. So this is a little bit later, but there's still that tradition of rich people, and especially, it seems, rich women, like the wives or the heiresses or whatever, doing this good work for the poor. So in a way, it was this stratified society trying to redistribute, goods for the common good. And anyway, in Rose and Bloom, she wants to be a philanthropist because she's a wealthy heiress, and she was doing the same exact work, creating orphanages and that sort of thing. And so this is what Mrs. Gladstone's doing. And she seemed to, I mean, this is a really favorable article. It's pretty adoring of her, very respectful. And so it paints her in a very good light. I don't know anything about Mrs. Gladstone. She was born into the upper class, and she married Mr. Gladstone, and she was in the public limelight for a long time. She seems to have conducted herself well, and she seems to have really been absorbed in this work. She herself would come down to the hospital and talk to people and see if they could go into this home for convalescents. She would go and visit these orphans and play with them herself. So she seemed to be pretty invested in this work, and she did it for years and years and years. I mean, she built charity after charity. So it was a really interesting glimpse into 1893, to the mindset of 1893. You know, and it really reminded me of Louisa May Alcott's books. So that was my first article, and let me see, maybe I should show you. This is so delicate and falling apart. It's hard to read. Not all my magazines are going to be the actual ones. I've got some that, oh boy, that have been bound. So, but let me show you just, let's see, what page is this? I can't, let me find it, right? Oh, here we go. No, that's not it. Oh dear. Mrs. Gladstone. So here's some of the illustrations in the magazine. Let's see if we can get a picture of Mrs. Gladstone herself. There's some more. This magazine is really, I thought there was more of like a photograph of her. Well, I don't see it. There's a sketch. And there's another one. This magazine's really interesting. It had a running, at one point in its heyday, it had running articles on, or, you know, every volume would have something on art appreciation. They had a feature where they would show the photographs of famous people through their ages. You know, photography was still kind of new. They would publish books in chapter form. So I think Ida Tarbell wrote a book on Lincoln, and the chapters appeared here. Rudyard Kipling appears here, like he wrote things. Robert Louis Stevenson. So, and then there's also short stories, there's poetry. So it's a really interesting mix, and of a very literary, you know, educated quality. So it's pretty fascinating. So anyway, so that is my magazine challenge. I don't want to talk any longer. I will link to Sean Standfast, and I'm going to watch his second video, and I highly recommend watching him because he is just he's a treasure. He's just so full of great information and knowledge about these old magazines. So I hope you have a good day and that you're doing well, and I will talk to you later. Bye.